Shortly after 9 in the morning on October 25, 1944, the Japanese force off Samar had reached the opening it had come for. Its battleships and heavy cruisers had broken through to the eastern side of the Philippines. The American escort carriers in front of them were slow, lightly protected, and already losing ships. Beyond those carriers, in Leyte Gulf, lay the vulnerable shipping that sustained the Allied invasion. Then the Japanese guns began to fall silent. The ships that had spent more than 2 hours chasing a weaker enemy started turning north. For the American sailors still alive, the change made no sense. They had not destroyed the Japanese fleet. They had not outrun it. They had not suddenly become stronger. What they had done was make the battlefield increasingly difficult to read. That loss of clarity would help change the decision of Admiral Takeo Kurita at the exact moment when clarity mattered most. To understand why, the story has to begin before sunrise, with two fleets moving through the same waters under different false assumptions. The larger battle was the campaign to retake the Philippines. American forces had landed on Leyte, and the Japanese Navy had committed much of what remained of its major surface strength in a desperate attempt to disrupt the invasion. Kurita's center force was the heaviest part of that plan. It included the super battleship Yamato, 3 other battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers. The day before, American carrier aircraft had struck it hard in the Sibuyan Sea. The battleship Musashi was lost. Other ships were damaged. From the American side, those attacks appeared to have broken the force badly enough to remove it as an immediate threat. But Kurita did not remain in retreat. He turned back toward the San Bernardino Strait, passed through it during the night, and emerged east of Samar before dawn. At almost the same time, Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet was racing north. A Japanese carrier force had appeared in a position that invited attack. Those carriers were part of a decoy plan. Halsey went after them with his fast carriers and battleships. The result was a dangerous gap. American commanders did not share one clear picture of who was covering San Bernardino Strait, how much striking power Kurita still possessed, or how quickly he could return. By morning, the force east of Samar that was least prepared for a surface battle was suddenly the one standing in Kurita's path. Its radio call sign was Taffy Three. Behind Taffy Three was not another armored battle line. It was the support system for an amphibious invasion. Leyte Gulf held transports, landing ships, supply vessels, and the floating infrastructure required to keep troops ashore fed, fueled, armed, and reinforced. Those ships were valuable precisely because they were not battleships. They carried the material without which the landing could not continue at the same pace. The value was not abstract. Fuel, ammunition, food, landing craft, and reinforcements all depended on that exposed maritime system. That made Kurita's breakthrough strategically dangerous, even if the exact consequences of a successful attack can never be known with certainty. A heavy surface force entering the Gulf could have inflicted severe losses on shipping, never meant to withstand battleship gunfire. Taffy Three therefore faced 2 levels of stakes at once. At the tactical level, its own ships were trying to survive. At the operational level, every minute of delay helped keep Kurita farther from the vulnerable logistics concentration to the south and gave other American forces more time to react. This is why simple ship versus ship comparisons miss part of the battle. The escort carriers were weak surface combatants, but they were standing in front of something more fragile and more important than themselves. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's task unit contained 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The carriers were small, slow ships intended to provide air support and anti-submarine protection. Their screens were built for escort work, not for trading heavy gunfire with battleships. On that morning, many of their aircraft had been prepared for missions against submarines or targets ashore. Bombs, rockets, depth charges, and machine gun ammunition made sense for supporting troops on Leyte. They were far less useful against the armored hulls of a major surface fleet. The mismatch was not subtle. Kurita had battleships with guns that could reach far beyond anything Taffy Three could answer with. His heavy cruisers could run faster than the escort carriers. His ships carried armor that could shrug off much of the American gunfire from the smaller escorts. On paper, a clean engagement favored the Japanese so heavily that the American problem was not how to win a conventional surface battle. It was how to keep the Japanese from fighting one. At about 6:45, lookouts on Taffy Three began reporting large ships to the northwest. At first, the silhouettes were difficult to interpret. Tall pagoda masts rose through the morning haze. Then shells began landing around the American formation. The splashes were marked by colored dye, used by Japanese ships to help identify their own salvos. Red, green, and other colors erupted in towering columns around the escort carriers. The question of identity vanished. This was not Third Fleet returning from the north. It was Kurita. Sprague ordered his carriers to turn away and make smoke. He also had to launch aircraft, which meant repeatedly maneuvering into the wind even while trying to escape. Flight deck crews worked under shell fire, pushing aircraft forward and sending them off with whatever useful weapons were already available. The carriers ran south and east toward rain squalls. Their speed was limited. Kurita's faster cruisers were closing. From the Japanese side, however, the sight picture was not nearly as simple as the material balance suggested. Kurita and his officers had expected powerful American naval forces somewhere in the region. They had incomplete reconnaissance and limited knowledge of Halsey's exact position. Through distance, haze, smoke, and the distortion of scale at sea, the small escort carriers could be mistaken for something more dangerous. American screening ships could appear larger than they were. That uncertainty mattered because Kurita was not merely hunting transports. He had to assume that powerful carrier aviation might be close enough to punish any delay. Instead of slowing down to build a disciplined, unified battle line against the weak ships in front of him, Kurita ordered a general attack. The command released individual Japanese ships and divisions to pursue and engage targets as opportunities appeared. It made sense if the carriers ahead were fast fleet carriers that might escape. Against Taffy Three, it created a different problem. The Japanese numerical and firepower advantage remained enormous, but its shape changed. Cruisers accelerated on separate courses. Battleships maneuvered independently. Ships screened one another less effectively. Command and target assignment became harder. The battle began to spread across miles of ocean. Kurita still had the stronger fleet, but he had given up some of the order that made that strength easiest to use. Commander Ernest Evans on the destroyer USS Johnston saw the same geometry from the opposite side. His ship could not stop the Japanese formation by standing between it and the carriers. If Johnston simply remained with the screen, Japanese gunfire would continue to close the range until the carriers were caught. The pursuing ships had to be forced to turn. Turning cost time. Turning disrupted firing solutions, and torpedoes could make even a battleship or heavy cruiser turn. Evans did not wait for a perfectly organized counterattack. He turned Johnston toward the Japanese force and accelerated. A destroyer designed for speed and escort duty was now charging directly toward ships that could destroy it with a few heavy shell hits. The decision looked suicidal because, in a narrow sense, it was, but it was not pointless. Johnston's weapons could not match Japanese guns at range. Its torpedoes could still force a lethal choice at close distance. Keep coming and risk a hit below the armor belt, or turn away and surrender momentum. As Johnston advanced, it laid smoke. Other American ships also generated thick smoke screens, and the carriers used rain squalls whenever they could. The smoke did more than hide hulls. Japanese naval gunnery depended heavily on optical range-finding. A battleship could carry enormous guns, but those guns still needed a target that could be seen, measured, tracked, and predicted. A wall of smoke across a moving battlefield made every one of those steps harder. Johnston closed on the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. Its 5-inch guns could not punch through the cruiser's main armor at long range, so the American gunners concentrated on what they could damage: exposed positions, directors, and superstructure. Then Johnston launched its torpedoes. Kumano was hit and badly damaged in the bow, forcing the cruiser out of the immediate pursuit. For Taffy Three, that result was important for more than the loss of one enemy ship from the chase. It proved that the tiny screen could impose decisions on the larger force. A cruiser that had been racing toward the carriers was suddenly turning, slowing, and dealing with damage. The geometry changed again. For the men aboard Johnston, the attack was now measured in seconds rather than miles. The ship had driven close enough that the relative size of the opponents was no longer abstract. Japanese cruisers filled the horizon above the destroyer's low deck line. Their turrets were armored structures. Johnston's protection was essentially the strength of its hull, and the speed with which Evans could keep changing course. The 5-inch batteries kept firing because even shells that could not penetrate a heavy cruiser's main belt could still damage the systems that allowed that cruiser to fight. Rangefinders, exposed directors, anti-aircraft mounts, bridge positions, signal equipment, and the people operating them all existed above the armor that protected engines and magazines. That distinction became one of the recurring features of the battle. The Americans rarely had the weapon required to destroy the center of a Japanese ship. They repeatedly attacked the parts of the ship required to see, communicate, aim, and react. After the torpedo run, Johnston's survival depended on disappearing. Evans turned back toward smoke while Japanese salvos converged on the destroyer. Heavy caliber hits tore through spaces never designed to absorb them. Steam, electrical power, steering, and gun control became local problems solved by men working in compartments that were filling with smoke, fragments, and water. Evans himself was badly wounded, but command did not stop with the damage to one man or one station. Steering orders were passed by improvised means. Damage control teams isolated ruptures. Gun crews kept whatever mounts still worked in action. The important point was not that Johnston somehow ignored the physical effects of Japanese fire. It did not. The ship was being dismantled. The important point was that its tactical effect continued after the first torpedo attack. Every minute a Japanese ship spent shooting at Johnston was a minute not spent making an undisturbed approach on the escort carriers. Every time Johnston vanished into rain or smoke and reappeared from another angle, the Japanese had to identify, range, and engage it again. The destroyer was converting its own destruction into delay. Then Johnston paid for the attack. Heavy shells struck the destroyer. Machinery was damaged. Steering became difficult. Evans was wounded. Johnston disappeared into rain and smoke long enough for its crew to recover what control they could. The ship had not escaped the battle. It had bought minutes. And the other escorts were now spending themselves for the same currency. Hull's attack showed how expensive that delay could be. The destroyer drove toward battleships and cruisers, firing guns and torpedoes while shells bracketed it from several directions. A torpedo attack did not have to score a hit to matter. The mere sighting of tracks could force a ship weighing tens of thousands of tons to stop thinking about the carrier ahead and start thinking about the weapon approaching its hull. Large warships could turn, but they could not turn without consequence. A hard maneuver altered speed, bearing, formation spacing, and the geometry of every gun already trained on another target. One ship's evasion could force a second ship to adjust. A firing lane could disappear. A cruiser gaining on the Americans could suddenly find itself moving across the wake of another Japanese ship. Hull absorbed repeated hits while continuing to fire until damage overwhelmed it. The ship's end was not evidence that the attack had failed. Its purpose had never been to survive a duel with a battleship. Its purpose was to make the Japanese formation pay in time and attention for every mile it gained. Heermann, the last of the 3 American fleet destroyers, survived the morning but operated inside the same violent geometry. It maneuvered through smoke so dense that friendly ships appeared at dangerously short distances. It launched torpedoes toward the Japanese line, fired its guns, and repeatedly changed course to avoid both enemy fire and other ships moving through the same obscured water. The torpedo threat from the destroyers reached beyond their immediate targets. Tracks moving through the Japanese formation forced reactions from ships farther back, including Yamato. The flagship's evasive maneuver carried it away from the center of the chase for a critical period. That did not make Yamato harmless. Its guns remained among the most powerful afloat, but power displaced from the decisive point is power temporarily unavailable, and command displaced with it suffers an additional cost. Then came Samuel B. Roberts. Roberts was a destroyer escort, smaller and less heavily armed than Johnston, Hull, or Heermann. It had been built to protect convoys and hunt submarines. Against heavy cruisers, the sensible role for such a ship did not exist. Its commander, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, nevertheless took Roberts into the attack. Engineers pushed the ship beyond its normal operating expectations. The gun crews closed to a range at which their rapid fire could rake the exposed portions of Japanese ships. Roberts launched its small torpedo battery and then kept firing 5-inch shells as quickly as crews could load them. The target was not an abstract tonnage figure. At close range, American gunners could see superstructures, directors, mounts, and fires. They concentrated on what their weapons could affect. Roberts' gunnery became so intense that the guns themselves became a maintenance problem, barrels and mechanisms heating under the sustained rate of fire. The ship was spending ammunition, machinery, and ultimately its own hull to keep pressure on Japanese cruisers. Eventually, heavy shells found Roberts. The size difference reasserted itself with brutal clarity. The destroyer escort was crippled and later sank. But by then, the Japanese pursuit had been forced to absorb attack after attack from ships that should have been tactically insignificant compared with the battleships behind them. Sprague ordered the screen to attack. USS Hull and USS Heermann drove toward the Japanese force. The smaller destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts joined the fight as well. These ships were not trying to sink every battleship and cruiser in front of them. They were creating repeated local emergencies. A torpedo warning forced a turn. A destroyer appearing from smoke demanded attention. Rapid 5-inch fire threatened exposed bridge personnel and optical equipment. A new smoke bank broke visual contact. A rain squall erased a target that had just been ranged. Each event was small compared with the total power of Kurita's force. Together they attacked the one thing his fleet could not replace during the battle, a stable picture of what was happening. Hull moved into torpedo range under intense fire. Its attacks forced Japanese ships to maneuver, but the destroyer was hit repeatedly. Guns were knocked out, machinery failed. The ship slowed while enemy shells continued to strike. Even as Hull was being destroyed, surviving gun crews kept firing. Heermann made its own torpedo attack and maneuvered through smoke at close range. At one point it found itself in a battlefield so compressed and obscured that American ships were in danger of colliding with one another while trying to attack the Japanese line. Torpedoes from the American destroyers forced major Japanese ships to react. One of the most consequential reactions involved Yamato. The Japanese flagship maneuvered away from torpedo tracks and for a time steamed on a course that carried it away from the center of the action. The effect was larger than the physical threat alone. Kurita was aboard Yamato. As the flagship maneuvered, the Admiral's view of the battle became less direct. The scattered nature of the general attack had already made centralized control difficult. Now the flagship itself was displaced from the most intense part of the pursuit. The strongest ship in the battle was still afloat and still dangerous, but the commander on its bridge was losing contact with the battle he was supposed to control. Then came the air attacks. Taffy Three's escort carriers launched what they could as the emergency became clear. The pilots faced a weapons problem from the beginning. Many aircraft had not been loaded for attacking battleships and cruisers. Some carried general-purpose bombs or rockets. Some carried depth charges. Fighters relied on machine guns that were not designed to penetrate heavy armor. But the value of an air attack is not limited to whether a bomb can sink a ship. Aircraft forced the Japanese captains to react vertically as well as horizontally. A cruiser trying to maintain a firing solution on a carrier now also had to watch the sky. An Avenger diving toward a ship might carry a weapon capable of damage, or it might not. A fighter strafing a bridge could not sink a battleship, but it could make exposed personnel take cover. A near miss could damage topside systems. A bomb that could not penetrate a main armored deck could still wreck lighter structures, start fires, or disrupt anti-aircraft positions. Most important, every attack demanded a decision before the pilot revealed exactly what he could do. Turn or hold course, keep firing or evade, stay in formation or avoid a collision while another ship maneuvered. As aircraft expended their ordnance, some pilots continued making dummy attacks and aggressive passes. To a ship under pressure, a diving aircraft did not come labeled as empty. The captain still had to decide whether to believe the threat. That turned limited ammunition into continued uncertainty. The Japanese force was now fighting 3 different kinds of friction at once. The carrier aircraft added a different kind of asymmetry. Pilots did not have the luxury of waiting for the ideal weapon load or organizing one perfect strike package. Aircraft launched as the decks and wind allowed, sometimes individually, sometimes in small groups, and attacked with whatever they carried. An Avenger designed to deliver a torpedo could find itself over the Japanese force with a depth charge or a general-purpose bomb instead. A Wildcat built to fight aircraft could arrive with only its machine guns. Under normal conditions, those mismatches would sharply limit what the pilots attempted. At Samar, the objective was broader than sinking ships. A depth charge exploding beside a cruiser could still shock the hull or damage exposed structures. A fragmentation weapon could tear through unprotected topside positions. Machine gun fire could drive men away from exposed bridge wings and anti-aircraft stations. Even an attack that caused little physical damage could force a maneuver at the exact moment Japanese gunners were trying to hold a target. This is why the repeated air attacks became disproportionate to their actual destructive power. Imagine the problem from a Japanese bridge. Smoke already obscures the American ships. Reports of torpedoes arrive from one side. A cruiser ahead has slowed or turned. Another ship crosses the line of sight. Then an aircraft drops out of low cloud, nose pointed directly at the bridge. The captain cannot pause to ask whether the bomb racks are empty. If he guesses wrong, the consequence may be immediate, so he maneuvers. The maneuver saves the ship from a possible bomb, but it also forces the gunnery team to rebuild the solution against the carrier that was being tracked seconds earlier. When the aircraft pulls away and another appears, the process begins again. By continuing aggressive passes after their weapons were gone, some American pilots extended this effect beyond the life of their ammunition. They were no longer delivering explosives. They were delivering uncertainty. That uncertainty was especially damaging because the Japanese ships were not maneuvering as one compact, mutually supporting line. Kurita's general attack had already encouraged a pursuit in which individual ships and divisions were solving their own problems. Air attack multiplied the number of those problems. The sky did not stop the Japanese advance by itself. Japanese ships continued to shoot close and score hits, but the aircraft kept interrupting the process by which closing speed became accurate gunfire. On the surface, American destroyers and destroyer escorts kept appearing from smoke with torpedoes and rapid gunfire. In the air, aircraft attacked from scattered directions and in uneven waves. Around both sides, rain and smoke repeatedly changed visibility. None of those factors erased the Japanese advantage. They made it harder to convert that advantage into a clean, continuous pursuit. The damage was accumulating anyway. Samuel B. Roberts, much smaller than the fleet destroyers, drove into close action against Japanese cruisers. Its crew pushed the ship hard, fired torpedoes, and then used its two 5-inch guns at a furious pace. The little escort could not survive indefinitely inside the gun range of heavy cruisers, but it could force those cruisers to deal with it. Shells struck Roberts and eventually crippled the ship. It would sink, Hull would sink as well. Johnston, already damaged and still fighting, re-entered the action and drew fire until Japanese shells overwhelmed it. Commander Evans disappeared with his ship. These losses are sometimes remembered as proof that courage defeated superior firepower. That description is emotionally understandable, but tactically incomplete. Courage mattered because it was converted into specific effects. The destroyers did not merely charge, they forced turns, they laid smoke, they attacked optical systems and exposed positions with the guns they had. They launched torpedoes along courses that created danger beyond the immediate target. They made Japanese commanders solve urgent, local problems at the expense of maintaining a unified pursuit. Their sacrifice had a mechanism. Without that mechanism, bravery alone would have changed nothing. By now the Japanese heavy cruisers had still managed to close the distance on the escort carriers. The smoke could not last forever. Rain squalls moved. The Japanese gunners adjusted. American carriers began taking heavier damage. USS Gambier Bay fell behind and came under concentrated gunfire. Shells struck the carrier. Flooding and machinery damage mounted, and the ship eventually capsized and sank. It became the only American aircraft carrier lost in the Second World War to enemy surface gunfire. Other escort carriers were hit or straddled. Flight decks and topside structures were damaged. Crews fought fires while aircraft tried to find places to land, refuel, or rearm. The American defense was working in the narrow sense that the pursuit had been slowed and disrupted. It was failing in the equally important sense that the ships doing the disrupting were being destroyed. This is the limitation that makes Samar more than an underdog legend. Taffy Three could create delay. It could create uncertainty. It could force maneuvers. It could damage exposed systems and with torpedoes, seriously hurt much larger ships. But it could not manufacture armor, speed, ammunition, or replacement ships. If the battle continued long enough under improving visibility, Japanese firepower would keep collecting a price. That is exactly what began to happen. The question became whether Kurita understood the battlefield well enough to keep pressing through the cost. By late in the action, the margin was disappearing. The smoke screens that had hidden the escort carriers were thinning. Rain squalls could not be commanded to remain over the American formation. Destroyers that had created the most dangerous torpedo threats were sunk, sinking, or badly damaged. Aircraft had burned fuel and ammunition through repeated attacks. Japanese heavy cruisers still possessed working main batteries. Battleships still loomed beyond them. The Americans had not solved the material problem. They had postponed it. That distinction became visible around Gambier Bay. The carrier could not maintain enough distance from the Japanese ships. Heavy shells began striking with destructive effect. Machinery spaces flooded or failed. Speed fell. Once a slow carrier lost even more speed, the pursuit became merciless. Gambier Bay listed, rolled, and went down while other carriers continued running under fire. Elsewhere, Johnston returned to the battle despite its earlier damage. The destroyer that had opened the American counterattack was now slower, wounded, and increasingly surrounded. Japanese ships concentrated fire on it until its guns fell silent and the order to abandon ship came. The screen was being consumed. For the men on the remaining carriers, the tactical success of all those earlier attacks could not feel like success. They could see Japanese masts through gaps in the smoke. They could see shell splashes walking closer. They knew the ships that had been buying time were disappearing one by one. The Japanese force had suffered damage and disruption, but it still had enough gunpowder to destroy what remained of Taffy Three if it could reassemble the pursuit and keep the range closing. This was the moment when the American defense reached its physical limit. And it was also the moment when the Japanese command reached its informational limit, and by the middle of the fight, his information problem was severe. The Japanese had begun the morning uncertain about what American force they had found. The resistance they encountered made the answer more confusing, not less. Small American ships attacked with an aggressiveness that seemed out of proportion to their size. Aircraft appeared again and again. Smoke concealed the number and identity of ships. Radio traffic suggested that additional American help was being summoned. Kurita knew that Halsey's fast carriers were somewhere in the broader theater. He did not possess the clean real-time operational picture that modern observers can reconstruct afterward from maps and logs. He had fragments, reports from ships fighting their own local battles, sightings distorted by smoke and range, torpedo warnings, air attacks, damaged cruisers, uncertain enemy identities, a flagship that had been maneuvered away from the center of the action, and a strategic clock that could not be seen but could be felt. Every minute spent chasing the escort carriers was another minute in which stronger American forces might appear. From the American side, the truth was almost the reverse. Taffy Three was not the forward edge of Halsey's fast carriers. It was a thin escort group fighting with ships and aircraft never intended to stop a battleship force by itself. But the Japanese could not act on that truth until they believed it. And belief under fire is built from information. At Samar, the information reaching Kurita kept pointing in more than one direction. The American carriers looked like a valuable target. The resistance looked too violent for a weak target. The aircraft attacks suggested carrier strength. The absence of a decisive American heavy surface force suggested weakness. The possibility that such a force was approaching suggested a trap. The Japanese cruisers were gaining ground. Some of those same cruisers were damaged, scattered, or forced into repeated maneuvers. Kurita's original mission lay to the south in Leyte Gulf. The battle in front of him was pulling his force east and north, away from a simple run toward that objective. This was the paradox. The closer the Japanese came to destroying Taffy Three, the less coherent Kurita's operational picture became. The Americans were losing ships while gaining time. The Japanese were winning local gunfights while losing formation, orientation, and confidence in what those gunfights meant. Shortly after 9, Kurita ordered his scattered ships to break off the pursuit and regroup. For sailors on the surviving American carriers, the effect was almost surreal. Heavy gunfire that had dominated the morning diminished. The colored shell splashes stopped walking toward them. Japanese silhouettes that had seemed certain to close the final miles began turning away. The Americans did not immediately know whether the change was permanent. They had every reason to expect the attack to resume. Their screen had been mauled. Destroyers and escorts were gone. Gambier Bay was sinking. Other ships were damaged. Aircraft were scattered across the area, some low on fuel and ammunition. Yet the Japanese force did not return to finish the chase. Kurita eventually withdrew toward San Bernardino Strait. Why he did so has been argued ever since, because no single cause can carry the full weight of the decision. The losses and damage to his cruisers mattered. The threat of continuing American air attack mattered. The scattered condition of his formation mattered. The uncertain location of powerful American carrier forces mattered. The time already spent in the battle mattered, and the fog of information created by the morning's fighting tied all of those pressures together. It would be too simple to say Taffy Three fooled one admiral with a single trick. There was no single trick. There was a chain of tactical actions that repeatedly denied Kurita the stable conditions needed to judge risk with confidence. The first link was the Japanese assumption at contact that the carriers ahead might be more powerful than they really were. The general attack then fragmented the Japanese formation. American destroyers exploited that fragmentation by launching torpedo attacks that forced large ships to turn. Smoke and rain disrupted optical tracking. The flagship itself maneuvered away from the main action. American aircraft multiplied the number of threats Japanese captains had to process, even when those aircraft carried inadequate weapons or no remaining ordnance. Damaged cruisers and scattered reports made the tactical picture look increasingly expensive and uncertain. By the time Kurita had to decide whether to continue, he was no longer evaluating a simple contest between 4 battleships and a handful of small carriers. He was evaluating a battlefield he could not confidently define. That distinction matters because it explains why material superiority did not automatically produce the expected result. Firepower only becomes decisive when command can place it against the correct target at the correct time, while preserving enough cohesion to exploit the result. Kurita had the firepower. Taffy Three attacked the rest of the equation. The cost to the Americans was enormous. Johnston Hole, Samuel B. Roberts, and Gambier Bay were lost in the surface action. Many sailors were killed, and many survivors entered the sea where rescue would become another ordeal. The surviving ships of Taffy Three were not untouched victors. They were battered ships whose crews had held together long enough for an enemy decision to change. And even that outcome should not be overstated. It is impossible to know exactly what would have happened if Kurita had continued into Leyte Gulf. The anchorage contained transports, landing ships, supply vessels, and support shipping, whose loss could have been severe. But the wider American naval and air forces in the Philippines did not cease to exist, and counterfactual history cannot be reduced to a guaranteed Japanese strategic victory. What can be said is narrower and stronger. The center force had reached a position from which it threatened the logistical system supporting the Leyte landings. Taffy Three stood in the way with ships that were materially unsuited to stop it in a conventional battle. The small force survived long enough and fought disruptively enough to help turn a clear Japanese material advantage into an uncertain operational decision. That is the real achievement. Not that weak ships became strong. Not that machine guns somehow defeated battleship armor. Not that courage suspended physics. The physics never changed. A heavy shell still tore through a destroyer. A slow escort carrier still could not outrun a cruiser. A 5-inch gun still could not become a battleship weapon simply because its crew fired faster. What changed was the sequence of decisions those physical facts produced. A torpedo forced a turn. A turn broke a firing solution. Smoke hit a target. A hidden target required reacquisition. An air attack forced another maneuver. A maneuver opened distance. Distance bought time. Time allowed aircraft to return and more ships to scatter. Scattered ships produced fragmented reports. Fragmented reports deepened uncertainty. And uncertainty changed the risk calculation on Yamato's bridge. The men of Taffy Three did not need to destroy Kurita's force to prevent it from using all of its strength at once. They only had to keep making the next Japanese decision harder than the last. That is why the battle off Samar remains so unsettling. It is usually remembered through the size mismatch. Small escort carriers and thin-skinned destroyers against battleships and heavy cruisers. But the deeper mismatch was between material power and usable information. Kurita's ships carried more armor, larger guns, and greater speed than the American carriers. The Americans could not take those advantages away, so they attacked certainty. They filled sightlines with smoke. They filled approach lanes with torpedoes. They filled the sky with aircraft. They forced heavy ships into local evasive actions. They made a weak force look dangerous in exactly the ways a commander already worried a stronger American fleet might be dangerous. And because the Japanese formation had already been loosened by the general attack, every new threat was harder to place inside one coherent picture. The result was not a clean American victory at sea. It was a collapse in Japanese confidence at the operational level before American resistance collapsed at the tactical level. That difference is why the retreat happened when it did. South of the battle, the shipping in Leyte Gulf remained largely beyond Kurita's guns. North of it, Halsey's fleet was still fighting the decoy force that had helped create the opening in the first place. Between those two larger events, a small American escort group had been placed in a position no planner would have chosen for it. Its sailors could not repair the command confusion that had exposed them. They could not summon battleship armor onto their decks. They could not change the speed of their carriers. They could only decide how to spend the few advantages they still possessed: smoke, weather, aircraft, torpedoes, maneuver, and the willingness to close with a force that should have overwhelmed them. They spent those advantages on time, and time changed the battle from a target problem into an information problem. By the time the Japanese force disappeared northward, the surviving Americans were not watching an enemy they had physically defeated. They were watching the consequence of an enemy commander who could no longer trust the picture in front of him.